They're all on the front line of this struggle, but Steve has put himself in harm's way. He's gone to the Donbass to cover the conflict unfolding there, the special military operation of the Russian Federation in resistance of the expansion of NATO imperialism, and he's put himself in the front line in the midst of a war, literally. So we salute his courage and heroism, and we really look forward to hearing his speech and his update on the situation there. Thank you so much, Steve.
Comrades, I'm a bit shorter than Ranjit. I'm going to bring this down a little bit. Comrades, sisters, brothers, it's a great honour to be invited to speak to you today. And I bring you greetings from revolutionary Donbass, and most specifically from the Donetsk People's Republic. While understandably, all eyes are on the situation now unfolding in Gaza, the shelling of Donbass, the shelling of Donetsk continues every day, as it has done for the past 9 years, with NATO-supplied, Western-supplied, British-supplied weapons falling into civilian areas, killing and maiming as the world turns away and closes its eyes. Now, I've seen this on a daily basis. It's become so natural now that the sound of artillery shells, the sound of HIMARS, the sound of storm shadows, and the sound of the heroic air defences has now just simply become part of the rhythm of the day. It's as usual as hearing traffic driving past, the dogs barking, and you can distinguish between whether it's an incoming or an outgoing missile. I was reporting from a shop that was destroyed just on the outskirts of Donetsk city centre, and it was a NATO-supplied artillery shell that had crashed through a grocery store, killing an elderly woman as she popped in at lunchtime to do her shopping. Her shopping bag was still on the floor, the blood was there where she was killed. And the shop workers were trying to salvage what was left of their stock. Most of it had been destroyed. And I was outside, there was a couple of children, and I saw them eyeing the bottles of whiskey that I was also eyeing. And I think that I looked at them, and then we heard a noise, a boom, a familiar noise, and I kind of looked, and they looked at me and said, "Oh, it's okay, it's air defences, it's ours, don't worry." Now, they must have been about 10 or 11 years old, these children, and no child should really be able to distinguish what kind of sound is being made. They shouldn't be exposed to this kind of thing, but this is now part of their daily life. Many of them have grown up knowing nothing else but NATO war on their people. Now, I often make a comparison and say that Donbass and Donetsk is like Palestine, like the Russian Palestine. There's one key difference, of course, which is now we have the Russian armed forces that are creating a protective barrier between, on the one side, the people of Donbass, and on the other, the Ukrainian and imperialist forces. Now, don't be fooled by what certain forces in this country are telling you. I can tell you with absolute certainty that the people of Donetsk, the people of Donbass, support Russian troops. They support them for a very, very good reason. Now, we've heard these cries of Russian troops out, coming even from those that consider themselves on the left in Britain. The anti-war movement is saying that Russian troops are out. And we always say, Russian troops out of where? And we know what would happen if Russian troops left Donbass, if they were to withdraw. And if you want an idea of what would happen, look at what's happening in Gaza right now. This is what will happen. And the people of Donbass, the people of Donetsk know that what faces them is a genocide because they've witnessed it every day for 9 years. The dehumanizing of them, the description of them as orcs, the banning of their language, their culture, their tradition, their books, their composers are now banned. Statues being torn down across Ukraine. Now, contrast this, by the way, in Donetsk. I made a short film about this, about some of the statues in Donetsk. But in the centre, well, obviously we saw Lenin at the centre, and Boris told me a very interesting story about how the communists defended Lenin from being torn down, the statue of Lenin from being torn down, by Svoboda, by the Azov who came into the square and tied a rope around Lenin, tied it to a car and tried to tear it down and pull it down. And Boris mobilized the communists to defend the square, to defend Lenin, to defend communism, just as they're defending Donetsk. But in Donetsk, in the center, you have at one end of, in the center, a very nice boulevard, Pushkin Boulevard. But you have a statue of Pushkin, the famous Russian poet, the famous Russian author, the founder of the modern Russian language, and a national icon of Russia. Now you could walk down Pushkin Boulevard from one end to the other, and you reach the other end of the boulevard, and there you see a statue of Taras Shevchenko, who is the Ukrainian national poet and a symbol of Ukrainian national identity. But unlike in the West, where statues like Pushkin's and Dostoevsky's, Chekhov's are being pulled down, the statue of Taras Shevchenko remains untouched. And that tells you there is no hatred of the Ukrainian people. And I think that the people of Donetsk and Donbass are very clear about that. Now, I'm not going to give you a history lesson, but I think there's some important background to know, really, about the deep connections between Donetsk and Britain. Donetsk was founded by a Welshman, a Welsh engineer called John Hughes, and he won a tender to plate the harbour at Kronstadt, his Millwall Ironworks company. But in order to do that, he needed two things. He needed material and he needed manpower. Now, the material for that came from Donetsk, where he founded the metallurgical factories and the mines that really make up the area. So the very first people, the very first migrants to Donetsk were from Merthyr Tydfil. They were miners from Merthyr Tydfil. Now these people, Donetsk was named Yuzovka in his honor. It changed its name many times. It was called Stalino, Stalin. There is a rumor it was named Trotsky very briefly, but there's no evidence to support that, and nobody really talks about it, perhaps unsurprisingly. But these are the very people, the foundation of Donetsk, but also Lenin, the great man himself, described the Donbass as the beating heart of the Russian Revolution. And it was these people, the revolutionary people of Donetsk, that powered the Russian Revolution, that sustained the Russian Revolution. And it's those very people that kick-started that movement there. The same people that vanquished the region from Nazi occupiers in 1943, in September 1943. A people's movement that fought against those Nazis. It's the same people now that are fighting against the neo-Nazis of the Azov, the proxy fighters of the imperialist forces today. Those people on the front line. The people on the front line. Yes, there are now Russian soldiers after the special military operation. But it was the people's militias that were set up, consisting of nurses, of shop workers, of miners, and of teachers. They are the people that are now fighting the neo-Nazis. And it is because of this that we know that the imperialist forces are doomed to defeat. Now, I made, comrades, the analogy with Palestine earlier, and I just want to tell you about one particular incident. And we can see a lot of similarities, there are some differences. But if you'll recall the attack, the destruction by Israel of a hospital in Gaza very recently. And we saw how the media then started casting the seeds of doubt and saying, well, maybe it was Hamas that did it. Maybe it was a Hamas misfiring rocket. Anybody that knows anything about this kind of thing will know that Hamas does not have anything with the capability to destroy a hospital. Now, I saw the exact same thing in Donetsk. It was around 10 o'clock in the evening, we heard an almighty explosion, louder than the type that we normally hear, so we knew something serious had happened. And in a town just outside of Donetsk called Makiivka, it's a strong mining town, and a hospital had been struck. I went to the scene with my crew. We drove there, and the scene was, as you'd expect, one of absolute chaos. The hospital had been very, very badly damaged. The windows had all been blown out. There was some structural damage inside. People were trying to keep things going because this was the place where people come for emergency treatment. And I spoke to a number of the medical staff there. I spoke to some cleaners, people that had been hiding in the basement. We spoke to members of the local community who were, sadly, they're used to their community being shelled. I mean, if you drive around, and we did, and we looked, and there's the roofs of most of the apartment blocks have got holes in them. There's buildings that have been incredibly badly damaged and destroyed. Now, this was a standard thing, really, for me. I turn up at shellings. I can go to one every single day and report on it. And this time I turned up. We made a short film for the news about this hospital being attacked. I did a short piece then for social media. I posted it on Twitter. We drove back, and I'd had an incredible response, thousands of people commenting. And they started out saying, this didn't happen. The hospital was not attacked. This is Kremlin propaganda. You're making it up. This didn't happen. Look outside. You can just see there's a few broken windows. And then I added the rest of the footage to the tweet and said, well, here's the inside of the building. You can see the damage. And we'd spoken to a health worker whose home had been destroyed. But then they changed once they realized, well, the hospital was struck. They said, well, actually what happened was the Ukrainian forces struck a Russian ammo dump, which was nearby. And it was in a disused block of flats. And they cooked, which means that that they'd been struck, and then all of a sudden all of these artillery shells and missiles then flew off, and it was that created the damage. And again, this was a lie. We have to tell it like it is. I was there, and these people that were sitting behind a computer in London or America or in somewhere in Europe, the NAFO crowd, the anti-Semitic troll farm, obviously they thought that they knew better than the people that live in Makiivka, the people whose homes had been destroyed, the health workers that I spoke to, and myself who was on the ground. Now, I counted it and said, well, this is impossible because that very street that you're showing this map of, I drove down. I drove down that very street, and there was no military presence there. There were no military roadblocks. There was nothing to suggest that what you're saying actually happened, because you would expect to see the remnants of the artillery shells. There was nothing like that at all. And also, nobody in the local community was complaining about Russia hiding arms there, which you would expect at least one person to break ranks. So we kind of see that this is the imperialist playbook, and they will they would use the media as a, ironically they talk about Russian propaganda, when the biggest propaganda machine we're seeing with the BBC, with CNN, with Channel 4, with the Times, the Telegraph, the Mail, and everything that they have at their disposal. So there's a reason why they do this. There's a reason why Russian media is banned, is blocked. And it's very, very clear, because there are war crimes and atrocities being committed in Donbass every single day. I see it every single day. I see health workers being killed. In Gorlovka, I attended the shelling of a fire station in which a firefighter was killed. Emergency services, I got caught up in one of these. We went to a shelling, and what quite often happens is, when you turn up at these places, when you turn up at the health centres or the fire stations, what they'll do is they'll wait a while until the emergency services arrive on the scene, and then they'll attack again to cause maximum damage, but targeting those health workers. And one of them, back in May, was killed whilst she was on her way to work. She was in the Petrovsky district, which is one of the districts just outside Donetsk. It's one of the outer districts. It's one of those that comes under frequent daily shelling. And she was driving on her way to work to their local hospital, and there was a shelling of a bus stop. And this is another frequent thing. 13 people killed in the shelling of a bus stop. She stopped to administer emergency care to those that were wounded. And just minutes later, there was another shelling, and she was killed instantly. Now, if this kind of thing, if the attacks on fire stations, if the killing of nurses and health workers, there was a health worker killed just last week, a few days ago, a health worker, 3 journalists from Izvestia were wounded. But if these incidents that have now become part of everyday life there, if they happened in Lvov, or they happened in Kiev or any other city in Western Ukraine, they would be front page news in every single newspaper. They would be broadcasts on BBC, on Channel 4, on ITV, calling for Vladimir Putin to be charged with war crimes. So we see how this works. And people probably don't know about the cluster munitions that are being fired into civilian areas. Now this, again, just days after the United States announced that it was sending cluster munitions to Ukraine, they were already there, right? Let's be clear about that too. Those cluster munitions were already there. The United States just announced that they were going to authorize their use. I think on the Friday, Antonio Guterres, said that the use of cluster munitions he'd heard reports they were being used in civilian areas in Donetsk, in Donbass, which they were. And he said they should be consigned to the dustbin of history, which is all very well and good, but they did nothing about it. And just 2 days later, the first civilian victim since the announcement was claimed, a journalist for RIA Novosti called Rostislav Zhuravlev. He was a communist, he was a comrade, and he was killed in the Zaporozhye region, ironically, after he had been investigating with another group of journalists the use of cluster munitions targeting civilian homes in that area. And as his car left, it was deliberately targeted by Ukrainian forces, and very sadly, he was killed. Now, this was denounced immediately by Maria Zakharova as a war crime, and I actually wrote a story about this, a news story. So I contacted the so-called press freedom groups and international journalist organizations, asking them for comment and to condemn it. Now, I had a number of reactions, generally silence, or we need to find out some more information before we comment. But the International Federation of Journalists, to their credit, issued a statement condemning the killing of a journalist and demanding an immediate and independent investigation into his killing. Now, this led to a response from the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine. And they issued a statement. They were quite angry about this. UNESCO, bizarrely, issued a similar statement to the IFJ, which I was quite surprised about. But the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine issued a statement celebrating the demise of what they called a Kremlin propagandist, and ruled out the fact that he was a journalist or that he should be treated as a civilian, because, of course, targeting civilians is a war crime. But, of course, he was the journalist union cheering that on. So just a brief segue into this, just to talk very briefly about what happened at TUC Congress earlier this year with motion C21, when the biggest trade unions in the country all fell in line behind perhaps the most reactionary motion that has been seen at that body for decades. And it called for essentially arms to Ukraine. And when they say arms to Ukraine, they don't mean to the revolutionary defenders of Donbass, which we would love to see those weapons supplied to the people that are defending the area. But of course, they meant the very bombs, the very missiles that are killing trade unionists and killing workers in Donetsk. Now, I think the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, the so-called Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, a front for the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, has played a particularly pernicious role in this. And they're lying. They're deceiving you. They're pretending that workers in Ukraine and left-wing organisations in Ukraine are supporting the call for more arms and more weapons, but they're not. The leftists actually in Ukraine, most of them, are in prison. Their organisations have been banned. The Communist Party of Ukraine was closed down and had all of its assets, its buildings, handed over to the state. Most of its members are in prison. It's been banned from standing in elections for a very, very long time. We haven't heard a peep about them from the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, by the way. They're not interested in freeing actual leftists or standing up for workers. Every single news organisation, media organisation has been shut down as well. This is the democracy, the democratic values that we're supposed to be defending. The burning alive of trade unionists in the Odessa Trade Union House, of which I've met some of them. I've met some of the survivors of that horrific tragedy. But again, not a word about that. In fact, they follow the line that it was the pro-Russians that did it, the Russian separatists that did it. They killed themselves and burnt themselves alive. So we see this, they're also part of this kind of propaganda exercise. But the very trade unionists that they're claiming represent workers inside Ukraine are nothing of the sort. These workers, if you ever hear something about free trade unions, then alarm bells should already start ringing. But one of the trade unions that they said was a representative of free mining union in Ukraine is in fact nothing more than an imperialist shill. He is somebody that handpicked a member of the Azov battalion, the far-right neo-Nazis, to be his right-hand man in that union. He is somebody who organised at the height of the Maidan coup, and he organised fake strikes, which were in reality bosses calling their workers and forcing them to stand outside their factories for 1 hour, and then they were filmed by Poroshenko's news channel and showed on a loop to say, look, this is the people going on strike. They are supporting the Maidan revolution, which of course they weren't. And worse than that, he said that the miners of Donbass are supporting the Maidan revolution. And they said, well, bring them to the square then, which of course he couldn't. So he got his own workers to put on miners' hats and parade around pretending to be from Donbass. Now I can tell you again with absolute certainty that the miners of Donbass do not support the Maidan coup. Those trade unionists, I've been down the mines in Makiivka, which I mentioned. I've been down that mine and I've seen the workers there, and I've seen how production has fallen by a third. Why? Because one of the first things when the independent Ukraine was born after the collapse of the Soviet Union, mines turned into a racketeering business. And they filled in those mines, actually. They filled a lot of them with water to stop them from producing coal. But production has fallen at the moment by something like a third. And the reason is because, one, those very mines are being shelled by Ukrainian forces. And two, because the revolutionary miners, just as they did in 1943 when they fought against the fascists then, are now on the front line fighting to defend their homeland. So we know that this is not true. Another lie is this case, fabricated case against Vladimir Putin about I can't remember how many thousand it's supposed to be, 20,000 kidnapped children or something like this. I mean, this is absurd, and I think, I haven't got time to go into the detail of that, but there's been some very good research conducted by the Grey Zone on this. They've written about this being an absurdity and a fabrication. But unlike the journalists that write about this in the West, there was a series in the Telegraph where they spoke to about 3 or 4 people. And I read this article and the kidnapped children, and it amounted to this. This would have been the story had they bothered to report it properly without any sensationalism. Some children were invited to go to a summer camp in Crimea. Whilst they were in the summer camp, fighting intensified, so it wasn't really very safe for them to return home. So they stayed there. The kids, as teenagers are, got bored and wanted to go home, which they do. That's teenagers. It's in every country anywhere in the world. But this amounted to, no, they're kidnapping our children. But the organisers said, well, they can go, but it's not safe. Their mother said, well, I want to bring them home. So she went and collected them. She collected them. They went home and they went off then to live a new life in Kiev. And that was apparently evidence that Putin is kidnapping children. Now, I met scores and scores of these families that had been to these camps. I spoke to the children, I spoke to the parents, and what should have been actually a feel-good story about a Paralympian from Belarus organising holiday camps for disabled children, for people that are living under the daily shelling of their homes, of their schools. They can't go to school. There was an interesting thing talking about Kharkov having its first underground school being built. Well, great, but the kids of Donetsk haven't been able to go to school for about 8 or 9 years because they're constantly attacked, shelled and destroyed. So as a relief from that, he organised the summer camps. Now, most of those children went there with their parents. All of them went there willingly. I met one of probably the happiest child I've seen in not just Donbass, but anywhere, called Igor. And he loved it so much he wanted to go back. He was disappointed to have left this camp. And he came back and he'd had, what had happened there? Not this re-education, these re-education camps where they're being forced to learn Russian history and say Russia is great, Russia is wonderful, and all the rest of it. He'd had rehabilitation. He was told he would never walk. And he's come back now and he's taking his first steps and he's very happy. So I met these people, and the story is nothing even close to what you're being told. But perhaps the biggest lie of all is about Mariupol. Mariupol, for many people in this country, evokes images of Russian atrocities, Russian war crimes. All sorts of horrors are supposed to have happened in Mariupol. Now we're seeing the mercenaries, these 2 mercenaries, Aidan Aslin and Sean Pinner, who were captured in the steel plants in Mariupol as Russian troops advanced. They were captured. Pinner himself trained the Azov battalion members, the National Guard, whatever they call themselves, but he trained Azov for 2 years. This 2-year period was when they were committing, probably at their peak, the war crimes and the atrocities that we're seeing. This is when they terrorized the people of Mariupol for 9 years, 8, 9 years. But this is during the height of the atrocities, and they were shooting dead civilians. They were blowing up humanitarian aid centres. Many of them now are facing justice for their actions. You won't hear about this in Britain, I'm sure. In fact, the only thing that I saw about it was an article in the Daily Mail where they were lamenting the treatment of these people because they got shaved heads and they look a little bit poorly. They don't look like they've been treated very well. Well, they're treated a damn sight better than a lot of the Russian POWs, I can tell you that. And they're actually facing justice. They're facing a court hearing. They're facing trial. They're being held to account for what they did, these horrific crimes. And if you speak to the people of Mariupol, as I have, and I speak to them, I've been to Mariupol countless times. I've been to the Azovstal steel plant. I've met the people that were held hostage and used as human shields in the Azovstal steel plants, as that Azovstal steel plant was mined. Now, there's one name, if you remember this name, when you go home, Google this name, Natalia Uzmanova. And she was held in the basement. But when she came out, she told the world's press that were waiting for her what happened to her inside the catacombs of the Azovstal steel plant. But they carefully edited what she said. They chopped it, and they didn't include the part, and the full version is on YouTube. And perhaps maybe we could, as a party, put it up. I might do something about that because I'm working on a film about Mariupol and the Azovstal steel plant to try and change that narrative. But she explains very clearly what happened. And again, you can see how propaganda works because they cut off what she said. They cut off and they didn't want you to hear the truth. Now, I've spoken to countless people and I asked them how important it is for them to see justice meted out to these people for what they did in helping Mariupol to move on. And they all said it's very important, but even I was shocked when I asked what that looked like. What does justice look like? And I just approached random people in the street, people sitting in a park, people with families, what you would describe as respectable people. Not like me. And I asked them, what does that look like? And I would say 9 out of 12 people that we spoke to said they should be executed. And I was shocked, and perhaps I shouldn't have been, because they had to live with this every single day for 9 years. I've been in the homes that have been destroyed. I've seen the children of the families that have lost fathers and lost their families because of what happened there. Now, I don't want to go on too long. I've probably gone way over my allotted time. And there's so much that I can tell you. I can tell you about the elections that were held there very recently. Free, fair, transparent elections that Ukraine tried to stop from happening. That they bombed the polling station that I was in. That people are shot at. I've been shot at a few times now. You kind of get used to it, really. But just before I left, we had a mortar round fired at us. And journalists should never make themselves, I always think that journalists should never make themselves the centre of a story, because our role and my role is to give a voice to the voiceless, a voice to the people of Donbass, a voice to those that are silenced by the West, because you don't hear anything here about what's happening in Donbass. And the propaganda is effective, because when I show people, you know, the attacks on passenger buses, the blowing up of cars, the babushkas' homes that have been destroyed, and I actually heard another. I went to an apartment block that had been destroyed by. I've been to many that have been destroyed by cluster munitions, but this one by an artillery shell, and I was told this didn't happen, that this was fake, that these were actors. So I said, okay, so you want to believe that? What you want us to believe is that a group of, two 80-year-old elderly women managed to make a hole in the roof of their house. Right? They managed to mess up and destroy a bit of their kitchen, cover it in dust. Then they made a hole again in the floor of that kitchen, and they'd worked out the exact trajectory that artillery shell had taken. They happened to have a partly destroyed artillery shell, and they put it in the ground, and made a kind of an impact crater. And then they also got the entire of their apartment block to lie about it, join in the lie, and they managed to recreate the exact sound that an artillery shell makes as it crashes through a building, on the off chance that Steve Sweeney might hear it and turn up and do a report for a news channel that realistically nobody watches because we're banned. Right? That's what they'd rather have you believe. So I've been in the steelworks, I've been in the maternity hospital, I've been in the drama theatre in Mariupol, I've spoken to the people that were held hostage there, I've seen the shellings, I witness every single day the bombing of civilian areas, the cluster munitions that are killing people, the cluster munitions that have destroyed a university building, and we see all that, and then we see the TUC passing these reactionary motions that are, you know, that really are calling for the more killing, more death, and that's where we are. So just to finish, I'll just finish with a few quick things. Is that Boris, when I met Boris the last time, we were talking about, we did a short film about the Donetsk Declaration. This is quite an important declaration. It was a statement drawn together by communist and workers' parties in both Russia and in Ukraine. And it characterizes correctly the situation as a defensive war. It describes it as a just liberation struggle, a struggle for self-determination, a struggle against imperialism and its neo-Nazi proxies, and they're right to describe it in those terms. Now, I'm very proud that one of the first parties, in fact the first party, that agreed to sign up to the Donetsk Declaration internationally was the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist. I'm very proud. I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud to be a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, a serious organisation, serious comrades, and I congratulate the party for putting on today's important event celebrating the Russian Revolution. And I'll just finish. I could go on and on and on, but I can see. Hurry up. I'm hurrying up. So I'll finish, and I'll stay around afterwards and probably talk a little bit more if anybody wants to find out practical actions and things that we can do. We're making films, we're getting stuff out to trade unions about teachers having their legs blown off. I'm doing a film for the NEU about this to try and counter the lies of the Ukraine Solidarity campaign. So there's a lot of things that we can do, but I'll finish just by saying victory to revolutionary Donbass, victory to the Palestinian resistance, and victory to communism. Thank you so much.
Thank you.